Do we want to announce on here that we're going to do flush next?
Sure.
Because whoever's here is probably our best bet for actually joining in on that.
Well, hopefully if we talk about it on the actual podcast and say that it's going to be available for everyone. Some takers. Didn't seem like a ton of people wanted to jump on board for Chuck and Tito.
I'll be interested to see if people are like want to listen to it, even if they did not want to actually take the very understandable step of diving in here.
Oh, ice cream man.
Spin and Shab opens up notes on his phone.
I was thinking like,
tell you what, I'm gonna get him. I'm gonna get him.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna get it now. It kind of, it's one of those things where like when I'm recording phone calls for my recording and I'm using the Olympus TP8, it's like I can't believe that it's 2018 and this is what I'm doing. Can't believe that it's 2018 and like if you want to burn Dana White on your social media, you got to like the quickest way to do it is notes.
Notes.
Like you got to take a screenshot of your notes.
Mm-hmm. Fire up notes. That's the way you do it. It just makes sense.
Two Chucks. All right, are we going live?
We should be live here in just a minute. Yep, we're live.
Do we have any viewers?
Yeah.
Nice.
People are.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
You want to do the actual recording? Should we start the actual recording?
Hold on. Let's make sure everybody is aware that we're about to do this thing.
Okay.
Everybody, if you're watching now, you're going to want to take a second and just appreciate the grandeur of what's happening here. Double Chucks. What you got?
Double Chucks. This guy's still got his bobble, his anti-bobble.
Look at that head bobble. And I'm kind of regretting letting the ice cream man just go by without even.
The ice cream man did, in fact, go by.
Just a second ago. Ice cream man's rolled really by here. Couldn't even feel like we should have at least stuck our heads out and been like, "Hey, man, come back in an hour."
You know, when I was in Florida visiting my in-laws, we got ice cream from an ice cream boat.
What?
Yeah, it was a memory that children will remember for the rest of their lives.
Memory that I would remember if like I'm going to remember hearing about it.
Not the least of which because we almost crashed into the ice cream boat on our way out.
Nice. Nice player. Our first comment comes from Andrew Millington, who writes, "Cloudfall, motherfuckers!" Oh, sorry, wrong thread. My man. And then Randy Yap, who is here to say, "I didn't read the books, but I'm here for the show, and work is slow. Plus, I got to get my $5 worth. Happy Friday, guys." Happy Friday to you, Randy.
I wasn't gonna read this as part of the book club, but we did get an email to the Co-Main Event podcast, and this is written in all caps.
Nice.
It is from John Hackelman. John Hackelman. His listed email address is johnnyhack@thepitmma.com.
Okay, sounds legit.
Here's his message in all caps. Been looking for a copy of Scorched Earth. Willing to trade for one kid's birthday pit party or pictures of Chuck. You pay for shipping. Get at me ASAP. Currently in a bidding war on the eBay.
Okay.
So
that's a deal right there.
There you go, right there.
I got some of that rainforest coffee.
Gas station coffee.
Rainforest blend. Colombian rainforest.
You know, we have coffee here. Coffee available here.
Come from the rainforest?
From
which rainforest is it from?
Local black coffee roasting company here in Missoula.
No.
Not down with that?
Nope. All right, we can get started whenever you're ready.
You ready to do this?
I'm ready to do this.
All right.
You guys ready to do this? You better be. This is going to be a journey. The Great Dane is here to compliment us on our bobbleheads. We got to think about
those bobbleheads. I guess we'll say it on the actual show. You ready?
Yes.
Okay. Well, here we are again. The second ever Co-Main Event podcast book club episode. This one going out exclusively to patrons of the CME podcast.
Who we love very much.
Over at patreon.com.
Patreon.com/Co-Main Event.
Ben, we're sitting here at my dining room table. We got a couple of Chuck Liddell bobbleheads in between us.
You know we do.
These bobbleheads are going to be going out as special gifts to the two people that sent the best comments about the Chuck Liddell, Iceman, My Life in Fighting, and Tito Ortiz, This Is Gonna Hurt autobiographies.
And look at this. I mean, there's a whole presentation with these bobbleheads. It came in this box that like mimics the color scheme and design of Chuck's iconic Iceman shorts.
Oh, MMA bobblehead does not mess around.
No, they don't. There's even like a little inspirational card in here from Chuck himself.
Yep, signed by Chuck. Chuck's autograph is here on the top of the box.
Yeah, I mean, this is for real.
All right, so let's talk about what we're actually doing here.
Yeah.
You and I each got an assignment to read either Tito Ortiz's autobiography, which is the one that you read, or Iceman, My Life in Fighting by Chuck Liddell, which is the one I read, in a way to both celebrate and commemorate the fact that the Iceman and the Huntington Beach Bad Boy have signed on for a third installment of their landmark mixed martial arts feud. This one, we believe, going down at some kind of Golden Boy MMA promotion.
Right. Now, and I read, as you said, Tito Ortiz, the name is This Is Gonna Hurt, the Life of a Mixed Martial Arts Champion.
Which is sort of an ironic title in some ways.
Yeah, okay. Also, just the basic information you might need, 224 pages, published by Gallery Books, May 5th, 2009, the publication date of this one. Keep that in mind, because that is going to be important.
Yeah, do you have the length of Chuck's book over there, or just Tito?
Well, since Tito is my only responsibility, I figured maybe you would do that part, and you could tell us.
I'll look it up. I will tell you that whatever the page length of Iceman, My Life in Fighting is, it felt longer to read on the Kindle.
We're all familiar with how you felt like this was a slog for you. I gotta say, I did not necessarily feel like Tito Ortiz's was a slog. I felt like it went by pretty quickly. And also, though, there were moments reading this where I had to go in the other room and read something aloud to my wife. I was just like, I'm sorry, I apologize in advance, but you must hear this. And I knew it was a part that I really wanted to highlight for the book club podcast when, after I read it, she would make an involuntary noise of revulsion. And at least once she asked me, how can you read this? It was a serious question.
Yeah. I asked myself that. 305 pages, by the way, smiling over there as if you didn't know that you chose the much shorter of the two book report assignments.
Let's not start playing the blame game.
Chuck Liddell's autobiography, published by Dutton Adult Fiction, January 29th, 2008.
Okay.
Which will also become important because it figures prominently in some things I want to talk about regarding the Chuck Liddell autobiography. Ben, let's start here. Overall impressions. What did you think of the Tito Ortiz autobiography? What, if anything, did you learn about Jacob Tito Ortiz?
Here's the most important thing I learned. Tito Ortiz had what I would describe as a truly horrific childhood, which I feel like I heard a little bit about that, following Tito Ortiz and covering him over the years. But this really gets into the exact specifics of it, which help you kind of understand in some ways why Tito Ortiz is the way he is. And it gives you you can't help but have sympathy for him when you read about child Tito Ortiz, just a helpless child in the world trying to figure his way through, and the stuff that he was dealing with at home. His parents were both drug addicts, and it seemed to get really serious. He talks about at times coming home and noticing, oh, look, the TV's gone. Oh, look, other items have started disappearing from the house because my parents are selling them to get money for drugs. He, at one point, says, the smell of matches, lit matches, still makes him nauseous because he used to smell it in the house, and that's how he would know that they were cooking up some drugs. It tells at one point about having to run inside and alert his parents that the narcs were out in the yard, and then they all escaped out the back. Moving all the time just because they kept getting kicked out, kept getting evicted because they weren't paying their rent, couldn't pay their rent because they were using it all on drugs. A lot of crazy stuff goes on here in the early life of Tito Ortiz, and you get that sense of like a kid who wanted to get into something just to get him out of that house, just so he would not have to be there as much as possible. And yeah, you have a lot of sympathy for him. Also, an interesting thing that happens, an interesting formula for the book is that he says in the beginning, but basically recognizes the fallibility of human memory and says, I'm going to be bringing in some other outside voices who may remember things differently or may remember things that I don't remember. Those voices are, for the most part, his mother, his first wife, Kristen Ortiz, and Jenna Jameson. And it's kind of a jarring thing because it's not like I expected when he said that he was going to do that it would be like, okay, they'll get their own little like blurbs between chapters. But no, they'll just kind of burst in mid-chapter. It'll just be like a break, and it'll say Joyce Robles, like his mother, and there'll be a paragraph from her responding to something he has said. And then it'll pick up again with Tito Ortiz, which I've never read a memoir that quite does that.
Yeah, in and of itself, that's sort of an interesting approach. Like kind of a novel approach, really, that you don't get from the Chuck Liddell book. Did you find that that was effective or distracting or not worth it?
It was distracting at first, just because you're not really used to it. It also, at points, it will be like Tito says one thing, especially the most glaring example of this is at one point he talks about that his mother, as he put it, became a lady of the evening when she was addicted to drugs, and how difficult this was, And then she comes in and says, no, I never actually prostituted myself. I basically pretended to and ran a scam, but I never actually did. And I don't know if we're supposed to believe her. I don't know if Tito, it does not seem like Tito believes her. There are also points where, when talking about the breakup of his first marriage, he's presenting this version of events, and then his first wife is saying, yeah, here's what I think Tito was telling himself, but here's how it actually looked from my perspective. It's interesting because a memoir is usually like, hey, this is me telling you about my life. You get to kind of pick and choose what you think is reliable and what you think is not. And that's one of the things I liked in a weird way about fighter autobiographies, about pro wrestler autobiographies, is that I kind of compare it to when you watch the Olympic Games and the host country will put on an elaborate show, and they'll incorporate aspects of their history and culture into it. And it's like, they're not telling you who they are. They're telling you who they think they are, or who they want you to think they are. And that is as telling about them as anything else. And these books are kind of the same way. Like, you get a sense sometimes when he's telling you something and you're like, I don't feel like that's 100% true. Or in some cases with Tito Ortiz, he's telling you something that's verifiably untrue. And that's kind of like a win. You can see like not only how this person became this way, but also what story about themselves are they telling themselves.
Well, it sounds like you've already made Tito Ortiz into perhaps a more sympathetic character than we thought he was going to be here.
Well, that's the first part of the book, but it's okay.
Do you want to read this comment from Andrew Millington that I think in some ways plays off that idea?
Sure. This is a good comment from Andrew Millington. So this is going to start out weird, but I swear it'll come full circle. I also listen to The Flophouse, one of the infinite bad movie podcasts out there. In a classic episode, they talk about Tango and Cash. If you're not familiar with the film Tango and Cash with Sylvester Stallone and Kurt Russell, buddy cop movie, specifically how it features nearly every action movie design trope possible to an absurd degree. One of the hosts says, "This seems like a movie made by aliens who have only seen movies." He's specifically talking about the prison scene where there's a basement filled with machines that make steam and not much else, giant fans and a water canal, a power plant on the roof with a zip line, etc. I bring this up because I feel like that's exactly the kind of thing that molded Tito into the guy we know today. His formative years were exclusively molded by either legitimate or wannabe tough guys who probably spouted incoherent, baffling trash talk 25/8. His version of success and his definition of cool were informed by the kids he ran with in F Troop. F Troop was the gang that Tito Ortiz belonged to as a youth in Huntington Beach. But he had the determination and willpower to actually make good on those desires. Once he actually hit the UFC, it's no surprise he became the poster boy for that era. Think about every bedazzled bar bro on the planet circa 2006, and their ideal self probably looked and acted like Tito. The difference is, it doesn't seem like he ever had a chance to not be that guy. In conclusion, I leave you dudes with a lightly paraphrased quote from The Stranger in The Big Lebowski, quote, "Sometimes there's a man. I won't say a hero, because what's a hero? But sometimes there's a man. And I'm talking about Tito here. Sometimes there's a man, well, he's the man for his time and place. He fits right in there, and that's Tito in the mid-2000s MMA scene."
Okay, so I am prepared to be fairly negative about the Chuck Liddell autobiography. And as a way of preamble, I want to say that the reason that I chose to read the Chuck Liddell autobiography was when I found out that the ghostwriter on this was Chad Millman, who is a former Sports Illustrated and ESPN journalist, a guy who was an associate editor at ESPN, the magazine, a guy that I have some mutual friends with, and a guy who, is a really good and legitimate journalist. So as I begin to talk about the problems that I had with the Chuck Liddell autobiography, I would just like to say most of the problems that I think I had with the book are with Chuck Liddell. It seems to me
as a
like,
person?
Well, just like, we'll get to that. Like,
Okay.
I think Chad Millman did about as good a job as you could have done to make this palatable to a reader. But if the introductory question that we're asking on the podcast about what we thought of these books is, what did you learn? I have to say, I learned almost nothing about Chuck Liddell in this book. In fact, like, I emailed you as I was reading it, and I said, this book, I have to be honest, is pretty dry. And by the time I got to the end of it, I was like, how on earth is this book about a professional cage fighter who in many ways was one of the chief individuals responsible for the golden era of the UFC? How is it so boring? How do I get such little insight into Chuck Liddell? And I realized, as a guy myself who's interviewed Chuck Liddell a couple times, reading this book is like talking to Chuck Liddell, which I am going to guess made him a nightmare autobiography subject for the ghostwriter, because he's just not going to give you very much. And there is some stuff at the beginning of the book, probably to me, the most interesting parts of the book is the first, 25, 30% of it, where it's about his childhood. And Chuck did have like kind of a hard knock childhood that I think is somewhat typical for an MMA fighter. He didn't really have a father present. He refers to his dad as his sperm donor throughout the book. His father figure was his grandfather, who they kind of sounded like they lived with him sometimes, and they lived on their own other times. He was raised by a single mom who, it sounds like, worked really hard to provide as much as she could for her kids. I believe Chuck has one brother and one sister. But after, like, you get through that period, which is sort of like childhood, sports, wrestling at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and then you get into the UFC career of Chuck Liddell. And it's weird, man. It's like you learn almost nothing that you wouldn't already know just from watching UFC pay-per-views. Like, an incredible portion of this book are exhaustive blow-by-blow accounts of Chuck Liddell's fights.
Okay, see, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that I thought was unexpected for me about Tito Ortiz's book is, like, if we're asking what did we learn, I learned the thinking behind and the slogan on every post-fight t-shirt Tito Ortiz ever wore. That he will never fail to leave that out. I learned the walkout music that he used for every single fight. A lot of Limp Bizkit, which also, sometimes there's a man who's just the man to that time and place. Limp Bizkit tells you a lot about what that time and place was. I learned nothing, almost zero, about the actual fighting part of his life. It was just like, okay, I got into wrestling in school. I turned out to be pretty good at it. Then a guy I beat in wrestling, Jerry Bolander, he was doing MMA. I thought, hey, I could do that. I got hooked up with Tank Abbott. He was a Huntington Beach guy. You know, I figured I could do this, and I started doing it. But here's, I have a sample. This is really indicative of what he actually has to say about his fights. I mean, there's almost nothing about training. He'll mention, like, okay, I was training really hard for this fight. That'll be it. Like, I was training really hard for like 2 months. But nothing about any sort of like technical details or anything. The only time he'll talk about a fight is if he lost and he wants to, like, you know, do the Tito thing where he gives you some excuses about why he lost. But here's a good example. This is him talking about the fight with Vladimir Matyushenko at UFC 33. First of all, this is also enlightening because this fight was on September 28th, 2001. Couple weeks after 9/11. Okay. The UFC, according to Tito, wanted to cancel the fight because of 9/11, and they thought too soon afterwards. This is from Tito's book. I said, no way. First of all, I needed the money, and the arena had already sold out all 13,000 seats. Fact check, by the way. I looked it up. Official attendance was 9,500. But I also felt that with all that had just happened, Americans would need this kind of fight to raise their spirits. People needed something, anything to unite them, and I felt strongly that this fight would help people begin to get over this horrible situation and begin the healing process. So again, that's Tito Ortiz helping America heal after 9/11 by fighting Vladimir Matyushenko. The event sold 75,000 pay-per-views, so maybe we didn't all heal in the exact same way on that one. But anyway, then when he talks about the fight with Matyushenko was billed as UFC 33 Victory in Vegas. The entire arena was rocking. I came into the ring carrying an American flag. My entrance music that night was the song Break Stuff by the band Limp Bizkit. Everybody was going crazy. People were screaming, USA, USA. I felt so great that this fight was taking place. I dominated from the opening bell and won a unanimous 5-round decision. That's it. And then we move on.
Okay, now see, that is the exact opposite of the Chuck Liddell book. Like, because if you come to the Chuck Liddell book and what you want is an exhaustive 2 or 3 page account, literal blow-by-blow account of his fight with Vernon Tiger White, you are in luck because you get that in this book. And I want to read this comment from Zach the Prosecutor because it's a good comment and it kind of mirrors some of my feelings about the Chuck Liddell autobiography after I got done reading it.
I feel like you do not want to fuck with Zach the Prosecutor.
Yeah, right? He writes by saying, let me start by saying I'm a big Liddell fan. I grew up a karate guy, and then, as now, the options for a karate guy in MMA are limited. So I was a big Iceman fan. That being said, after trudging through this book, I'm left with the burning question, why? Why write this book? Did Chuck not believe that we all thought he was a tough guy? Did he feel he had something to prove? I found myself frustrated because there was a ton of fodder for a really interesting look into what makes an MMA fighter. Abandonment issues, developmental delays, an unfair deck stacked against you, all things that might provide us a peek through the keyhole for an explanation of why someone decides they're going to make a career out of stripping to the waist and doing the damn thing in a chain link cage. Chuck's response, quote, none of that bothered me, which is a damn lie. You wouldn't put it in a book unless it bothered you. You wouldn't tell the world about it if it wasn't still keeping you up nights. Instead, you write almost 300 pages to affirm your tough guy lifestyle. My question is why? We all watched the Iceman fight. None of us doubted he was tough. I think this is a good question because, as I said when I was done with it, I was like, man, I just read like 305 pages about Chuck Liddell. I feel like I learned almost nothing that I didn't already know about him. And the obvious answer, as you said, was money. Right? Yes. This book came out early 2008. At a time when, frankly, book publishers probably wanted to pay mixed martial arts fighters for their autobiographies.
And a bunch of them came out around this time.
Right. Yeah. You get the weirdest part about this is that you get to the end of the Chuck Liddell autobiography, and the last 2 things that happen are that Chuck loses the title to Rampage Jackson, and then he loses his next fight via unanimous decision to Keith Jardine. So, like, that's kind of a weird place to end the autobiography. And the only way that I can explain that that's why this book ended there was that were the two most recent things that had happened.
Yeah, it just brought us up to the current moment at the time of publishing.
Yeah, and like it kind of ends it ends somewhat abruptly. There's a couple of pages where Chuck's like, there's a picture of Chuck like literally sitting on the beach looking at the water, and he's like, "What am I gonna do next? I don't know. Probably just keep fighting because I'm the Iceman, Chuck Liddell."
Well, he made good on that promise.
No, he did. To his credit, as it like relates to this upcoming fight with Tito Ortiz when they're both like in their late 40s. Chuck Liddell never once says that he's not going to fight until the day he dies. Like throughout this book, he gives absolutely the impression that he's never wanted anything out of life other than to be a fighter and maybe like 10 bar on the weekends, and that he's going to do it as long as he possibly can. And in fact, a good deal of this book, as you might expect, deals with like the rivalry with Randy Couture. And there's part of it just briefly touches on Randy Couture's retirement after their third fight. When Chuck knocks him out and Randy Couture says, "This is the last time you'll see these gloves and these shorts inside this octagon." And Chuck's like, "Well, wouldn't you know it, us jocks have a hard time walking away." And sure enough, Randy Couture came back less than a year later and he won the heavyweight title. And good for him. Like, he's so supportive about Randy Couture coming back out of his retirement. So you read that now knowing what has happened to Chuck Liddell, maybe it all kind of makes sense.
Yeah, okay. One thing that I found interesting, like, you saying that him having an exhaustive blow-by-blow account of these fights, and
Every
that
fight.
do you think that that helps explain, like you mentioned something earlier when we were talking about it, that maybe when you read about it and you see the enthusiasm that he has just for fighting in general, do you think that helps explain why he's back now? I mean, obviously money is a good reason why he's back now, but like when you read this, do you get a sense looking at that 2008 version of Chuck Liddell, like, yeah, this guy's sure going to have a hard time. Like, this guy will, any reason you can give him to get in there and get in a fight, he'll want to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this book is such a time capsule from 2007, 2008. And one of the things that Chuck Liddell says over and over again in this book was basically like, if I didn't have the opportunity to fight in the cage for money, I'd probably be fighting someone in an alley somewhere. Like, that's generally his attitude about fighting and kind of his attitude about life. Although I would say that Chuck Liddell's overarching attitude about life is, I'm not worried about it, I'm not thinking about it, and I'm not planning ahead. So like you read all that, and like it's not a surprise at all that he would come out of retirement to fight Tito Ortiz, at age 48 or however old he is. Interestingly enough, like I don't think Chuck Liddell is dumb. Like I think Chuck Liddell is kind of a bright guy. Like obviously he has a college degree, I think, in accounting, and weirdly enough, he tells you like to the penny what he made monetarily for every fight. So
that's interesting.
Very much like an accountant's autobiography, and he keeps telling you that he's good with his money and all this stuff. So like I don't get the impression that Chuck Liddell is necessarily dumb. It just doesn't seem like he's all that thoughtful. It just doesn't seem like he's going to spend a lot of time reflecting.
Not super introspective.
Or being introspective or worrying or thinking about stuff. And that includes having 2 kids with 2 different women like a year apart when he's in his early 20s. Just mentioned as a side.
Did you ever see the movie Cobb with Tommy Lee Jones?
Yeah, it was on like HBO and Showtime all the time.
Yeah, it's a good movie. I believe written by the same guy, or at least directed by the same guy who did Bull Durham, and he was himself a professional baseball player at some point. I can't remember his name, but excellent writer and director. But there's kind of the part where, for people who haven't seen it, it's about Ty Cobb, played by Tommy Lee Jones, and he had, in his later years, has hired a ghostwriter to basically write his baseball autobiography. And they're kind of traveling around, and he's recording all this stuff that he wants the writer to put in the book. And a lot of it is just really detailed baseball stuff. And the writer at one point is just like, come on, man, talk about your personal life. People don't want to read this book to read about how to hit a curveball. And he's like, yes, they absolutely do. And that's what they're going to get from my book, whether they like it or not. And the guy kind of is, this plot of the movie is the guy kind of secretly writing his own version, like where he tells the actual story of who this person was. And it's just such a disconnect between what the athlete thinks people will want to know and what they'd actually want to know. And it made me wonder, like, when I'm reading Tito Ortiz's book, and I'm like, man, I never get a sense of what Tito Ortiz thinks makes him a good fighter. Like, why are you successful at this when other people aren't? Like, you're beating people up. You just get the sense that he's just better. And maybe that's how he thinks of it, because there's just no information about it, too much anything that goes on in the actual fights. But then I asked, like, would I want that? How much of that would I want? I could have done with a little bit more just because I'm curious. Like, what do you tell yourself We've had that conversation about fighters before. Like, how do you get in a cage with somebody and tell yourself, I'm going to beat this person up, even though they've trained as hard as they possibly could too. So it is a delicate balance to strike. I also think one of the interesting things that I get from Tito Ortiz's book is a lot of internal contradictions. And they are big and small. For instance, I'll give you a small one. Tito Ortiz can't seem to decide whether he was a big kid or a small kid. Page 44, I was a pretty small kid, so the coach had me wrestle a couple of the varsity guys just to see what I could do. Page 46, that's 2 pages later. All of a sudden, I wasn't just the big guy who was always getting into trouble. Were you a big kid or were you a small kid? It shouldn't be that hard. That's a very small example. Now, here's a bigger, more substantive example when Tito Ortiz talks about his attitude toward money. This is from a quote on page 84. I mean, look at a guy like Mike Tyson. That guy made $400 million and he ended up bankrupt. For me, something like that was impossible to imagine. So as I started getting into the fight game, I felt that mixed martial artists should be getting at least as big a chunk as boxers. In the beginning, I was getting decent money for a fight. But even at that point, I knew I wanted more. Money was always on my mind. And he's saying, I'm not going to be like these guys. And then 2 pages later, Christian Ortiz breaks in. We blew Tito's winnings from that first fight in a few months. We went on a vacation to Cabo and we bought a lot of toys. For us at the time, that was just an amazing amount of money. Page 91. But the money wasn't really the most important thing to me. This is Tito. I fought for the love of fighting and for the attention that I never got as a kid. So you can't even agree. Like, a lot of his stuff that I found really interesting is him talking about as the UFC is growing and he's realizing, like, hey, I'm a big part of this. I'm a big part of the UFC's popularity. And he keeps going to the UFC saying, I want more money. And they keep saying, hey, we're operating this thing at a loss. We're not making any money yet. And he says, all right, well, when you start making money, I'm going to want some of it. And they kind of have this conversation several times. And you appreciate, a part of you appreciates this. You're like, yes, Tito Ortiz has the right idea. And that leads me to a question I want to pose to you, because he often sets himself up in that regard in opposition to Chuck Liddell. And some of this seems like he lost the fights, so he had to have something over Chuck Liddell. He has to give himself some kind of edge where he feels like he did better than Chuck. And the thing he tells himself is like, I was pushing for fighters' rights, pushing for more money, pushing for control of my likeness. And when they wanted me and Chuck to fight, I knew that fight was going to be huge. And I tried to get Chuck to agree with me, like, hey, if we both stand together, we can hold them up for more money and more control and more power. And they will have to give it to us because they want to see us fight. And according to Tito, Chuck kind of just caved and was happy to eat whatever scraps off the UFC table they were willing to give him. Chad's going to stop this, stitch it together like he does. Comments here. I don't. Sunny Weathers asks about the gang F Troop, like the TV show. Yeah, I guess so. There's no real explanation about why they're called F Troop. Although there is at one point, Tito says that F Troop wanted to use knives and guns at some points, and he said no. He was the guy who kept F Troop from being a murderous gang, and instead they were just a gang that beat people up. Also, Tim Barron says, Chad, chapter 34? Why?
What's chapter 34?
I don't know. I didn't read your book.
Are you talking about my book or the Chuck Liddell book? Because there's literally like 50 chapters in the Chuck Liddell book.
I think he's talking about the Chuck Liddell book.
I can only assume that's the one where he talks about all the girls that he does it with. Which is, and he says, he prefaces it by saying, now I assume you want to know about the life of an ultimate fighter and women, which is sort of like, no, man, probably could have done without that. But
also, Jamie Stokes says, I picked up Chuck's book about 3 years ago with every intention of reading it, and yet it still sits on my bookshelf unread. I'd love one of the bobbleheads, so as an alternative, I'll happily offer a review of my daughter's recent school production in its place. I mean, now you don't even have to read Chuck's book because Chad read it, so you don't have to.
That's right. All right, are you ready to pick this up again?
Yes.
All right. Yes, as has been commented on by a couple of people who read the Chuck Liddell book also, like this book basically reads like it could have been written by an executive at Zuffa LLC headquarters, which is interesting because for a while Chuck Liddell was in fact an executive at Zuffa LLC headquarters, but like the tenor of the book is very complimentary of everything that the previous owners of the UFC did. It's very, it speaks about Dana White in somewhat glowing terms. I actually want to read an excerpt that will show that to you. And in all ways, it kind of advances what people might call the Zuffa myth in a very 2007, 2008 kind of way. And it's interesting to note that Chuck Liddell is not all that negative about many other fighters in this book. The two people that he is really negative about are Tito, who he literally calls a coward, and Vernon Tiger White, who just like kind of got on his nerves, like talked a bunch of trash before their fight, I guess.
Vernon Tiger White's an awesome dude.
He's super nice. I did not expect that. But anyway.
I believe he's a prison guard in Nevada right now.
Just to give you a flavor of how Chuck Liddell writes about Dana White, which maybe we can talk about a little bit more moving forward. Here's an excerpt about filming The Ultimate Fighter Season 1. On the day the producers told the contestants they were going to step into the cage, Dana was in meetings with potential sponsors for the show, but Lorenzo Fertitta had stopped by to see what was going on. He listened as a producer explained there would be a fight after the next challenge. Before she could finish, the guys on the show were asking how much they were going to get paid. She said, "You're not getting paid. You're fighting for a contract in the UFC. That's it." Well, that didn't sit well. I believe the response from one of the guys was, "Screw that. We ain't fighting. We get paid to fight." Here was the problem. The Contender, the show starring Sylvester Stallone and Sugar Ray Leonard, had just started airing on NBC right before we put everyone together. The season was 3 episodes old, and when our guys moved into the house in Vegas, by then they knew that the boxers on the Contender were getting paid $25,000 per fight on the show. When they learned they'd be fighting for free on our show, well, they grumbled. That made Lorenzo nervous. He called Dana and said, "What's going on down here?" "What's going on where?" Dana answered. "I'm on the set, and these guys are saying they're not going to fight unless they get paid." "Dude, I'm on my way down there, and I guarantee they are fighting." All the guys had gone back home and were griping about fighting for free. Then, at 10 p.m., Dana called me, Randy, and the fighters back to the training center. Dana's a stocky guy with a shaved head who, even though he's not a fighter, would challenge any of those guys in a second. He's perfectly suited for his role as carnival barker of the UFC. That night...
That's not Chuck talking, but okay.
That night, he gave a speech that is still written about in the dozens of UFC blogs. It's called the "Do You Want to Be a Bleeping Fighter" speech. Here's how it goes.
They bleeped it out in the book?
The entire Dana White "Do You Want to Be a Fucking Fighter" speech is included in the Chuck Liddell book verbatim.
Okay, that's filling pages.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's filling pages in here. I will just read the very end of it. "Do you want to be a fucking fighter?" Except it says bleeping in the book, which is weird because there's swears throughout the book. That is my question, and only you know that. Anybody who says they don't, I don't bleeping want you here. I'll throw you the bleep out of the gym so bleeping fast, your bleeping
Come on,
head
we're
will
doing
spin.
this the whole way.
It's up to you. I don't care. Cool. I love you all. That's why you're here. Have a good night, gentlemen. Then he walked out the door. The next day, he promised that any fighter who knocked a guy out or forced him to submit would get a $5,000 prize. And the question of the guys getting paid for fighting wasn't an issue anymore.
So that's Chuck Liddell telling, like, what he seems to think is an awesome story about Dana White.
Yes.
But really, it's a story about Dana White getting a bunch of professional fighters to fight for free so that they could go on with this product as cheaply as possible, which he saw as a necessary vehicle for the success of the brand, the UFC.
Yes. And there's another story in this book, which I don't have marked, but it's like, it's one of those things where one of the things that's really interesting about this book is that you get almost none of the sort of like behind the scenes tidbits that might be interesting to a person who's reading this book while already familiar with Chuck Liddell's career. But there's part where Chuck Liddell talks about how he and Dana White are on the road all the time together promoting the UFC during the early days of the Zuffa ownership. And he tells this anecdote about how they're on the road in some town and they're drinking at the bar in the hotel, and Chuck Liddell goes to bed. Dana White is still there. A security guard from the hotel is like, "Who's that guy with the mohawk that you're with?" And Dana White's like, "Oh, that's Chuck Liddell. He's an Ultimate Fighter." And the security guard is like, "Oh, that shit is fake. I could fucking kick any of those guys' asses." And Dana White is immediately like, "I've got $5,000 that says that Chuck Liddell can make you quit in 2 minutes." So Dana White organizes some kind of sparring match between Chuck Liddell and this security guard in the lobby of their hotel in the middle of the night. Wakes Chuck Liddell up and brings him down to the lobby. And of course, Chuck Liddell whips the guy's ass super fast in under 2 minutes. And then Dana White feels so bad for the guy that he gives him some money the next day. And the chapter ends like, that's just how it was, us being on the road. And at least that night, we converted one new UFC fan.
Did you?
And that's when I was like, really? You think that guy would like thinks you're awesome now that you beat him up in the lobby of this hotel? But two things drive me crazy about that story. One, the way it's told in the book, it's like 2 paragraphs long, where I'm like, dude, you could spend a chapter telling me about the ins and outs of you beating up this security guard. And I, as a guy who doesn't know this story, would be super interested in it. But again, just doesn't seem like Chuck Liddell wanted to think or talk about it that much. And again, it's a story told like, this is how awesome Dana White is.
Well, see, and that's the thing is like not thinking about that one too much. As they would say in a lit class, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
Because how are you supposed to feel if you're Chuck Liddell and like you were asleep? Dana White wakes you up and is like, "Hey, get up, man! I got you a fight right now, down in the lobby against the security guard. I don't know anything about him. Anyway, come on, I got some money riding on it." And you're just like, "Okay, so I'm just the like the hired muscle here. Like whenever you want to show me off, you put me on my leash and you trot me out of the cage, and I go in the arena and do the thing, and then you put me back in the cage." I don't know if I would feel so great about that, and I would also feel like maybe we need to have a serious discussion about don't do this shit anymore, or at least talk to me before you agree to this kind of stuff. And yet, doesn't it seem like that's exactly what the UFC and Dana White in particular loved about Chuck Liddell, is that he would not ask those questions and would not overthink it?
Yeah, so it's weird that well, it's not weird, it's like perfectly understandable, but like obviously in the Tito Ortiz book, he writes a lot about how Chuck Liddell took table scraps from the UFC, and in Chuck Liddell's book, he writes about how Tito Ortiz was a coward because he was always injured and or holding out for more money. I want to read this response to the Chuck Liddell book from Brandon Boyd, because that and some stuff that you were talking about, Ben, a few minutes ago, I think gets to the heart of the two things that I think are interesting about the Chuck Liddell book. This is from Brandon Boyd. I read Iceman, My Fighting Life, and it was what I expected from a Chuck Liddell autobiography. An easy read that I believe numerous people use to pass the book report section of the GED. The one thing that did irk me is how the hell did we just glance over Dana White becoming his manager? One minute he's got 2 guys representing him, and in the next chapter, he just slips in that Dana is representing him with no background whatsoever. That might be a pretty fucking interesting career event that could probably use more than a sentence to explain. Again, it just doesn't seem like Chuck Liddell is all that interested in this. I understand that he's catering to an audience that already knows his life story and have pictures of themselves in the early aughts sporting shitty buzz-cut mohawks to prove it, but I personally wasn't a fan of the sport while he was popular. It seems to me that White representing him was a career-altering event that one that a noob, shit-eating wild man would like to know more about.
That's interesting, because there is a part in Tito Ortiz's book where he basically is without management, and then the UFC is like, here. Or Dana White was his manager as well, and then, yeah, that's what it was. And then when they bought the UFC and Dana White called him and was like, hey, I'm going to be president of the UFC, so I can't be your manager anymore. But here, this guy will be your manager. And it's basically like Dana's lawyer friend.
Yeah.
And it's a complete conflict. It's just like saying, like, all right, send this guy in to negotiate for you, but if he asks for anything we don't want to give you, we're going to be like, hey, man, get the hell out of here. Let's work together here. And the guy who gets screwed when you work together is the client, Tito Ortiz. And he seems savvy enough, at least like in retrospect, to realize that that's what was going on, but he seemed to also put up with it for a alarmingly long period of time. But he talks several, and like when this book ends, like talk about writing right up until the present moment, there's kind of like an epilogue where he's basically saying like, yeah, well, my talks have stalled with the UFC. So I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know where I'm going to go, where I'm going to fight. But, you know, I'm standing up for myself and I'm not going to take less than I think I'm worth. And basically also saying like there were years in there where they kept telling me the money will come later, the money will come later. And now they're super successful and super wealthy. And I feel like the money did not come the way they said it did. You know, even though he admits that he made really good money, especially for the time. And even when I look at some of the stuff that he has done and the way he's managed his career and think like, it's kind of amazing you made it this far, I always have to respect whenever one of those moments comes up in the book where he's just like, I realize that they are making more money than they're acting like, and I want my piece. And MMA fighters should have at least a big a chunk as boxers get. And he's fighting that fight way before anybody else was fighting it. And then, at least in his telling, when he tries to recruit other people to fight it with him, they won't.
Yeah. Okay, I can fill in some of the other side of this from the Chuck Liddell autobiography, because Number one, there's some parts earlier in the book when Chuck is like making his UFC debut and he's kind of fighting in other tournaments in Brazil. He fights Pele Landy Johns down there, and while Dana White is his manager, and Brandon Boyd
like a nightclub, right?
Yeah, Brandon Boyd is right. There is never a point in this book where Chuck Liddell explains that he went from being friends with Dana White to Dana White being his manager. It just happens. But there are lots of instances when the UFC was owned by someone else where Chuck Liddell talks about what a great manager Dana White was and how he would always fight for more money and how he would tell the owners of the UFC stuff like Chuck Liddell's not getting off the fucking couch for $2,000, which is interesting when you think about where Dana White is today. And it makes me wonder if he ever reflects on that dichotomy in his life. Number two, Chuck Liddell remembers or mentions in passing that once the Fertittas buy the UFC and Dana White becomes the president of the UFC and therefore cannot be Chuck Liddell's manager anymore, Chuck Liddell's new manager is one of Dana's good friends. So probably that same guy, I would guess.
This is me looking at the camera like Jim in The Office.
Okay, here are the two things that I think are worth discussing about the Chuck Liddell book, and they are somewhat interconnected. Number one, Brandon Boyd kind of gets to the question here. I finished this book and I couldn't help but wonder, who on earth is this book for? Because it is written in a way that makes it seem like it is for a very general audience. Like it is for people who don't know anything about mixed martial arts, don't know anything about Chuck Liddell. In fact, you get to the end of the book and then there's an appendix that is just basically like the UFC rules and regulations and like a complete recounting of Chuck Liddell's entire career.
See, that's interesting because the appendix in Tito Ortiz's lists what it said on his T-shirts. I kid you not. It lists every single one of the T-shirts and what his walkout music was.
So as a guy who, I mean, like I said, there's almost nothing to learn about the Chuck Liddell fighting career here that you wouldn't have known just from watching the pay-per-views. In fact, there's quotes from Joe Rogan, like stuff that Joe Rogan said during the pay-per-views is in this book, which again makes me feel for Chad Millman.
Yeah, that's him mining it for
right,
stuff.
Right, because I bet he had to stretch for length here, and so he included these exhaustive blow-by-blow accounts of Chuck Liddell's fights and like literally watched the pay-per-views and wrote down stuff Joe Rogan said to put in the book. So that makes me wonder, like, who's the target audience here? Is it people who know about Chuck Liddell? Because it doesn't seem that way. It seems like the target audience is people who are casually interested in MMA and want to know more about Chuck Liddell. And that brings me to my second thing that's
or
interesting.
It's somebody where your grandmother knows you're into this Ultimate Fighting stuff. She saw it at the airport. She bought it for you.
Right. Brings me to my second point that is interesting about the Chuck Liddell book. There is like an overarching but subtle waft of hope that comes out of this entire narrative. Like I said, like this thing is very much of its time, being published in 2008. So there's a lot of 2008 logic in it, like, oh, MMA is so much safer than boxing. Like, we're just getting started.
Going to be bigger than soccer.
We've got all these great numbers on pay-per-view. Like the first season of The Ultimate Fighter was this smash hit. We're so huge in the 18 to 34-year-old demo. There's just like this feeling of hope and anticipation, like, oh, this is just the beginning. This sport's going to get huge. Like everything is going to be great. And part of that hope, I think, is the feeling that in the future, people who didn't know anything about him would want to read an autobiography about Chuck Liddell.
In the future.
Because that's like kind of how it's written.
I want to read a comment here from the Great Dane. About the Great Dane, by the way, read both books.
Yeah, he did the Lord's work here.
Jesus
Christ.
Christ.
He read both books and sent us super long accounts of how he felt about both.
Yeah, I may not read this entire question. Apologies to the Great Dane, because it is quite lengthy. Also, he did not finish Tito's book. The Iceman sapped a lot of his energy, so he said he got about 90 pages into it. He says, for the portion of the book I read, I've never been to California, let alone lived there 35 years ago, but it seems like a much different place than where I grew up, southeastern Wisconsin, town of 2000. Obviously, from reading Tito's experiences, it seems gangs, crime, and drug use were much more prevalent in that society than where I came from. I find trying to empathize with this situation difficult. On that note, I find Tito to be a somewhat inspirational figure. If half of his claims about his childhood are true, parentheses, he is known for hyperbole, e.g. fighting with a cracked skull, it's amazing he was able to become a productive member of society, let alone a UFC champion. We all like to talk shit about Tito and laugh at him, but he came from a broken home filled with drug use, infidelity, crime, etc. He was able to rise from that and become a very marketable. Your phone ringing? Come on.
Yeah, it's my stepdad.
Become a very marketable UFC fighter. Even more remarkable, he was able to identify the need to be a self-promoter, while other fighters, e.g. Chuck, were more likely to fall in line with the UFC. Similarly, when he was opposite Ken Shamrock on Tough, it was very clear he felt an obligation to lead and train his team for their fights. Granted, editing could do great or terrible things for a coach on Tough, but I felt he came away from that season as a much more likable character than he was going into it. Prior to that season, he seemed like a punk who disrespected authority just to disrespect authority, but Tough added another layer of personality that showed Tito as a more complete person than the one we saw in the cage. Now, that I think is a good point, because I do remember that season of Tough where it was Tito and Ken Shamrock. And Ken Shamrock's team ended up hating him and almost like being an open rebellion, because he was doing that old school Lion's Den kind of training where it's just like, give me 500 squats, you weak pussy. And like, people were like, hey, are we going to learn to fight? Why are you yelling at us all the time? Why are you being mean to us? Like, you're our coach. Like, let's learn some stuff. And Tito was actually teaching stuff, and Ken was just doing old school tough guy stuff.
Yeah. Tito Ortiz is a really good tough coach, by the way.
Yeah, he was a really good tough coach. Yeah, it seemed like he had a lot to teach him. And as for the stuff about like his childhood, maybe I was able to empathize with it more because I did grow up in Southern California, and while my childhood was nothing like his, I definitely knew those kids because he talks, and he mentions places in California that I know pretty well, like Santa Ana, which is a rough area, and him talking about how he would go to school and put on a front, basically, because he wanted to be normal. He wanted everyone to think like, my life is just like yours. Like, there's nothing weird going on at home. I'm going to go to school, and like, school is the place where you can pull that off. Like, for the hours that school happens, you're just like any other kid. And I remember knowing kids like growing up in Southern California where like you would get kind of a glimpse of their life, whether it was when their parents were dropping them off or if you went to their house or something, and you'd see something and you'd be like, oh, wait a minute, there's something completely different going on at that kid's house. And he's really trying hard to hide it. Like, and this is a escape for him coming to school. And so I was able to kind of imagine like that Tito was one of those kids, and it makes your heart kind of breaks for him. And for him to be able to, like pull it together and not only like be a successful fighter, but be one of the fighters who actually sort of understood the business on his own, understood it better than a lot of other, even like current fighters. I do think that he probably doesn't get enough credit for that. Then again, there's going to be a lot of hyperbole, because there is a point here where he's like, me and Ken Shamrock fought on Spike TV and like 10 million people watch. And you look it up and it's like 5.7 million. So
still a lot.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to read the Great Dane's comment about the Iceman book, because why not? We can do them back to back. I read the entire Iceman book. It was not enjoyable. Unlike a good book, where you literally can't put it down, it pained me to pick up this book. At the start, Chuck makes the point that he wants to teach you something with each chapter, which is good, I guess. Unfortunately, I don't come away from most of the chapters learning anything that I can use, but good on him for trying. The book reads weird. It seemed to use very elementary sentence structure and vocabulary. I feel like this is what a book would look like if I wrote one. I don't mean that as a slight to the ghostwriter. I'm sure he knew who the audience and central character is and structured the book based on that. I just feel that the lack of eloquence is one of the main reasons I had trouble reading the book. I don't mind a book reading like See Jane Run when I'm reading to my 3-year-old. I just can't do it when it's for pleasure. In a book where Chuck can 100% control the content of the book and how it is written, I'd probably leave out the part where I'm a 25-year-old bartender bouncer dating a girl who's in high school.
What?
Yeah, he starts, the mother of his first child is 17 when they start dating.
Oh, yeah.
I find it unusual that Chuck felt the need to constantly assure us that he was good with money and was doing well financially. Almost seemed to bring it up too much, as if he doth protest too much, and maybe he's not as good with his financials as he states. But maybe he's fighting at 48 years old because he just loves the grind. Along the same lines, Chuck is oddly specific on how much money he was making per fight. I guess this is a prideful thing, but naming out the specific amounts he made for each UFC fight and the structure of his contracts was just an odd thing to include. It may be some sort of inferiority complex among MMA fighters, because I noticed a little of that in Tito's book as well.
That's interesting. I mean, I personally always feel like I want to know, tell me everything you can about the money and the way the contract works and everything. I'm always interested in that. And maybe just because the UFC has gone to such great lengths to try to obscure that and try to prevent people from talking about it. So, yeah, that stuff is always interesting to me. The stuff about dating the high school girl. Yeah. Let's talk about these fighters and women for a minute.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in this Chuck Liddell book. And like I said, the first 20 to 30% of the book is about like basically him growing up before he becomes a professional fighter, how he meets John Hackleman and starts going to the pit and stuff like that. And again, Chuck Liddell just kind of casually mentions as an aside that he started dating this girl who eventually becomes the mother of his first child when he's working at this bar and she's like 17 years old. But again, Chuck Liddell, he mentions that he like took some heat over it from his friends, like they like to make fun of him for it. But again, Chuck Liddell, just not worried about that. Just not really worrying about anything.
Okay. In Tito Ortiz's book, there are like 4 women who factor largely into his life. The first is his mother. The second is his first wife, Kristen Ortiz, who honestly comes away in this book seeming like the most reasonable and sympathetic character in all of it. And then there is someone identified only as a stripper named Heather from Las Vegas, who he starts having a like 4-year-long affair with while he's married. And then there's Jenna Jameson. And the stuff that you like, the window you get into his relationship with Kristen Ortiz, there's a moment in here where he talks about like when he proposed to her, and it was a time when in between fights he describes himself as being like an out of control partier, drinking every day, cheating on Kristen, going out with all these other women, and then one day he comes home and it's like Kristen really started in on me when I came home, and she's yelling at me and everything, and I look at her and I realize, man, I really love this girl. And so he goes to the bathroom and gets a ring and comes back with it and proposes to her right there after she's been yelling at him, reasonably so, for his behavior. And then that's when they decide to get married. And you're watching somebody make all these obvious mistakes, and yet to the character, like to the person as you understand him, they kind of make sense. And it seems like later on he kind of realizes, like, maybe with Jenna Jameson's help, a lot of your behavior stems from abandonment issues from your childhood, and like this attention-seeking behavior kind of stuff from your childhood. And he seems to realize that that is true. He also at one point goes to therapy, but then he decides therapy during fight training is bad because it made him feel soft. So that's kind of where that scene goes. But also there's a part where, you know, after he is divorced from Kristen and he is kind of seeing the stripper named Heather, no last name ever gets, she's the only, just Heather the stripper from Las Vegas. And he starts talking to Jenna Jameson via MySpace. And then he's like trying to go out with Jenna Jameson. She factors into this narrative too. And then there's a part where they both tell a story where he's like, yeah, you know, I was hanging out with Jenna in Las Vegas and everything. And then Heather walked up behind her and stuck her finger in her butt. And that's the first time you realize, wait a minute, you were hanging out with Jenna, who you're trying to date, and Heather the stripper, it was just with you? What is going on here? What kind of world is unfolding here? And this is the basis of this relationship that the two of them form.
I'm gonna stop this again.
Did it get too heavy for you?
Yeah, I just need some time to process all that.
Good, because I have one thing that you're gonna want to hear this, and you're gonna be sad that you heard it.
Maybe I can find a part where Chuck Liddell talks about how romantic he is, because that is in here.
How we doing, everybody? It's getting heavy. It's getting heavy.
Subject matter?
Yeah.
Oops. There's you know how sometimes in athlete bios there'll be like the little cutouts in the page where they'll like tell you on the side something else, like my favorite Gatorade flavors, and there'll be a list.
Red.
Yeah, there's a ton of those in here, and one of them is how to treat a girl right.
Oh, nice. See, and the Great Dane is trying to talk like Chuck didn't teach him anything useful. Come on, learn how to treat a girl right from Chuck Liddell. Are we ready to continue here?
Yeah, I'm gonna find the thing where Chuck Liddell talks about how romantic he is. All right, ready?
Yes. Okay, here's one that I want to read you just because when I mentioned my wife making involuntary noises of revulsion, this was a moment. He talks about how important he think it was to support the troops and how he went over to Iraq for like a USO tour to support the troops, and that going over there was a real eye-opening experience because he saw what people were really going through and how hard it is and how dangerous it is. He ends that section saying, "Seeing our soldiers at war really scared the shit out of me." Next paragraph, straight to this. "Going to Iraq was the first time in the year that Jenna and I had been together that we had been apart for any length of time, and I missed her. While I was gone, Jenna had decided to have a breast reduction, and when I got off the plane and saw her, I was pleasantly surprised. I had a brand new woman to play with."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Involuntary
noise of revulsion. The interesting things about that is that the way it's phrased, like she had decided to have a breast reduction, and I was pleasantly surprised, as if like he was sitting there thinking to himself, man, this is some bullshit. Like, what the hell? And then he saw her and then realized, like, okay, she looks slightly different now, therefore she is a brand new woman, because what makes a woman except for her breasts?
And also she's there for him to play with.
That's right. She's a human being to be played with.
An interesting note, there is also a couple of throwaway paragraphs in the Chuck Liddell book about where he goes to see like wounded soldiers at the hospital. And he's like, oh, this is when I realized they were the true heroes, and like the stuff that I do is a cakewalk, and I would never like want to go to war and get blown up. And like that's basically it. Like,
okay.
Two paragraphs. And maybe true to form, it sounds like there's a lot less stuff in the Chuck Liddell book about his relationships with women than there are in the Tito Ortiz book. Like he briefly discusses his relationship with the woman who becomes the mother of his first child. Sounds like he had a baby with another woman like within a year of that first child being born. And he always like makes the point that he's still good friends with both of them, again, because Chuck Liddell doesn't let anything bother him. But like that's kind of it. Like he tells an anecdote about how he takes his kids to Disney World after he wins the UFC title. There are some like braggadocio-filled asides about how he likes to take 2 girls back to his hotel. Sometimes he takes more than that. Women love an Ultimate Fighter, but it's always just like a couple of sentences or like a paragraph at the end of a chapter. One of which is like Dana White is so excited to have Chuck Liddell beat up Tito Ortiz in their first fight that he makes Chuck promise him that he's going to give him his gloves and his shorts so that Dana can put him up in his office. And so like the fight is over. Chuck Liddell gets like 6 girls to go back to his room. Dana comes over in the morning to get
You're going to play a pickup basketball game?
Yeah. Well, he says he brought so many girls home, he doesn't remember how many.
Okay.
Which I don't believe. But like Dana like comes into the hotel room and he like, as Chuck Liddell actually says, condoms hanging from the lampshades.
Why?
And then Dana White like gets the shorts and the gloves and leaves. And that's just like the end of the chapter.
Okay.
Just like that's in there for, I don't know why that's in there. I guess
you know why that's in there.
Because Chuck figures we want to know about his relationships with women.
One of the things that kind of struck me as I'm reading about Tito Ortiz and him telling us about like the way his career has unfolded and all this kind of stuff is that when he, especially at the point that he's at when the book is kind of finished writing, and it seems like he has laid out a plan for himself. He's like in his early 30s at that time, and he's like, okay, I'm going to fight for a couple more years and be done. And I wondered if you could tell that Tito Ortiz that 10 years later, he'd not only still be at it, but be gearing up for a 3rd fight with Chuck Liddell. Would he have thought like, okay, well, that's definitely not what I had planned. That's kind of weird. Or would he be like, hell yeah, that's fucking awesome. Kind of think it would be the second one.
Oh, I know for a fact that Chuck Liddell would be like, hell yeah, that's fucking awesome, because I just read his book and I know that that's like the only thing he cares about. But again, like I said, like this, we as the reader have this interesting perspective where we know what happens after both of these books end. And like I said, the Chuck Liddell book is like full of all of this hope and expectation, like things are going to be huge in the sport, and like it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger. So it's interesting now to look back on that at the ways like maybe those expectations have not necessarily come true for anyone. And like Chuck Liddell goes on this huge losing streak at the end of his career, and eventually gets told basically by his good buddy Dana White that he has to retire. Now he's coming out of retirement to fight Tito Ortiz at this Golden Boy event. We assume like kind of with the UFC's blessing, but yeah, it definitely puts a different spin on things to have like a decade's worth of perspective over what happens after these books end.
I want to read a comment here from Jeff of Atlanta. I have no comment or question about Tito Ortiz's highbrowed manuscript, and I'm about to tell you why. I decided to pick the Huntington Beach Bad Boys book for various reasons, each of which are my business, not yours. I downloaded the book onto my iPad because there was no way I was going to be caught reading a book with his giant head on the cover at the pool or beach. After downloading it, I plugged in my iPad for the night so I'd have a full battery to knock out a few chapters the next day. When I awoke, anxious to get into some classic Tito shenanigans, I discovered my iPad was dead, not responding to any pressed button, and no amount of troubleshooting could awaken it. Yes, this actually happened. My iPad committed suicide because it had ingested Tito Ortiz's life story up until 2008. Perhaps that is more profound a comment on the book than anything I could say had I actually read the damn thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
He killed it. It killed his iPad.
That's right. Also, it says, expect an invoice for iPad repairs in the coming weeks.
Yeah, we're not paying for that. This one from James Hawkins from Brisbane, Australia. I want to read this one because it does highlight some of the odds and ends from the Chuck Liddell book that I think are worth mentioning. He says, I was disappointed to find out that Iceman, My Fighting Life, was written in 2007, just after Chuck Liddell's decision loss to Keith Jardine. But while reading the book, you begin to realize that it can be viewed as an interesting snapshot in time when MMA was a very different place. Here's a couple of excerpts from the book that made me either cringe or feel an impending sense of dread, or both. Chuck Liddell on his relationship with Dana White, chapter 28, page 179. The beauty of our relationship is, even though he's technically my boss now, he never puts what's best for the UFC in front of what's best for me. Chuck Liddell on training, chapter 30, page 190. I've got a strong chin, which comes from years of fighting on the street, and I don't get my bell rung easily.
Okay.
Chuck Liddell on his post-fighting career plans, chapter 47, page 284. I could retire. As long as Dana is running the UFC, I'll have a job with him that keeps me comfortable. He's told me that.
I don't know about that.
Overall, I still think this book would have been a lot more interesting if it was written in 2018, especially to see how differently Chuck Liddell views his career since leaving the UFC and his relationship with Dana White. I also think that the book was written at the height of Chuck Liddell's partying ways, and Hunter S. Thompson, he is not. The book doesn't really offer much depth in terms of his relationships, thoughts, and personal feelings. Instead, especially in the second half of the book, focusing more on his fighting career and celebrity status. Other than his relationship with his grandfather and mother early in the book, I can't say I learned anything I didn't already know about Chuck Liddell. Overall, I rate this book 2.5 cans of Zions out of 5.
Careful being like, hey, I think it would be more interesting if it was written in 2018. You don't want to encourage him to write a sequel, do you?
Well, let's see how this thing with Tito goes, and then we'll talk. Wonder what Chad Millman's doing.
Yeah.
Maybe he could come back for the my second fighting life.
From the sound of it, it sounds like he may have had enough.
Yeah, that would be my guess.
So we want to wrap this thing up. Now that we've been going here about an hour.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say?
Well, does any of this give you any kind of perspective on a third fight between Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz, aside from maybe realizing that they both would be super into this idea even back then?
One thing that was interesting when Tito talks about the Chuck fights is that he has, let's say, a version of events that does not exactly square with how I remember the fights going. It's kind of like I got poked in the eye, or like I was hurt going in. You know, it's never just like you look at those two fights and you think Chuck Liddell is just going to beat Tito Ortiz every time, at least back then. And he definitely has a story to tell himself about those fights. Makes me wonder how important it would be to actually beat Chuck Liddell now to kind of get the last laugh.
Yeah.
And now it seems like his best chance to beat Chuck Liddell. Chuck's nearly 50.
Mm-hmm.
As we said after we saw the video of him hitting pads, maybe not quite as fast as he used to be. Tito's style might age a little better. Who knows? So he has actually a chance. It'd be interesting. And it's also interesting when he prides himself on being the business guy, the guy who is kind of like seeing the business of fighting for what it is. And then I hear that him claiming that he's not getting paid for the fight except for he's getting a portion of pay-per-view buys and ticket sales. So I'm like, that's interesting.
Yeah. The Chuck Liddell book it's notable that he does not make a ton of excuses for his losses. He pretty much plays the Rampage Jackson losses straight. He plays the Keith Jardine loss straight. He spends about a page and a half making excuses for his first loss to Randy Couture, which is weird because it's like juxtaposed almost directly in the book with him talking about how like Tito was always making excuses. Tito was a punk. Tito was a coward. Tito never wanted to fight me, etc.
What are his excuses for Randy Couture?
He blew out his MCL in training, and like I think that was the fight where maybe he had trained somewhere that was not the pit, and so he felt like he didn't have the necessary cardio to beat Randy Couture. And of course, then he comes back and beats him in the next two fights. Interestingly enough, Chuck notes in his own book that in the second fight he pokes Randy Couture in the eye right before he knocks him out inadvertently.
He's not wrong.
Something got into his eye somehow. I don't know how that happened.
Yeah.
Maybe because I'm always doing the hang loose with my hands on a bunch of people. And in the second, he notes that in the third fight, Randy Couture slips, which is true. He slips on a sticker on the canvas and then gets knocked out. So Chuck Liddell, like in terms of like that fighter thing where you constantly always have to find out the reason that you lost, and it can never be that the other guy was a better fighter. He makes some excuses for that first Randy Couture loss, but mostly he like he's basically like, yeah, I was trying to fight Rampage and like he just caught me on the chin, knocked me out. So it's like not a lot of excuse making from Chuck.
Okay. What do we want to do with these bobbleheads?
Well, I think we got to send one of them to the Great Dane.
Yeah, you read both of those books and send us lengthy stuff, then yeah. You
know who's going to be excited, I bet, about getting that Chuck Liddell bobblehead in the mail? Is
the Great Dane's wife.
Who seems to have an active Facebook.
I assume that she's going to allow him to place it in a very prominent place in the household.
Yeah, right up on the mantle.
Yeah.
Right up under the TV that he used to watch Scorched Earth.
I'm sure that she'll be very excited about that. What do we want to do with this other one?
I don't know. Should we talk it over and then we'll let that person know?
Okay. Also, this idea of the book club, I feel, is fun. I think that the next time, however, though, as you and I discussed, maybe we should read a book that is actually good.
Yeah, we're going to go with one of the greats. Maybe one of the greats is putting it a little strong, but like a book that's fun to read, a book that we think the people will like to read, a journey that we hope they will go on with us.
Yes.
So what are we going to do, Ben?
We're going to read Fletch by Gregory McDonald.
We're going to read Fletch, and we're going to do this quickly. Like we're going to roll out of this book club basically into Fletch.
Yeah.
And we'll do Fletch in like a month or month and a half.
And if you're sitting there going like, whoa, wait a minute.
This is too much reading?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Fletch is a really quick read. And if you're like, hey, I saw the Chevy Chase movie and I was not wowed, it's very, very different. The reading the book experience is way different.
But that gives us some interesting opportunities for the book club.
It does.
We could also watch the film of Fletch because we have done that before.
Well, that feels like it has to be a drinking game episode.
I mean, so be it if that's what it has to do.
Yeah, we'll, I guess, figure out exact dates of when we're going to do it. But if you're watching this right now, chances are that this kind of thing might be up your alley. You should consider picking up Fletch by Gregory McDonald. It's a quick read, a really fun read. And while it's not about pro fighting, it is probably going to be of interest to people for whom this was interesting. Yeah, so we're going to read and talk about that and probably have a lot more fun doing both.
Thanks to everybody who read Chuck's book. Thanks to everybody who read Tito's book. A special thanks to everybody who sent us in their thoughts. We couldn't do it without you. We will be back on Monday to resume business as usual at the Co-Main Event Podcast. Right now, we're out.
Already, Sunny Weather says, hell yeah, I'm in for the Fletch Book Club.
There you go. Got it.
There you go. I don't recall, though, does Fletch have a part where he talks about condoms hanging from the lampshades? Why wouldn't you just, okay, even if you can't be bothered to go put it in, like, the trash can, put it on the floor. Like, why are you
just flinging them?
Why are you flinging them? Why?
I don't know, man. I don't know.
See, sometimes you read a book to understand more and you come away with more questions than answers.
I mean, it sounds like if there is a second Chuck Liddell autobiography out there to be written, you are making a strong play to be the ghostwriter.
There's not enough money. There just isn't.
Not enough money in all the world.
All right, everybody. That does it for us. Thank you for joining us on this live stream. Hopefully, it wasn't too awful. Just gonna get one last bobble in there.
The heads will bobble more as they get some wear.
Yeah, they need a little bit of time to settle into their bobbles.
Like a baseball mitt, you got to work them a little bit.
Don't say that. All right. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you Monday.